Hi, everyone. It's good to see you all. Thank you all for coming. My name is Ryan Sakaro. I'm the director of the Next Steps Transition Program at Ideal, and we're really excited to have Cayle to be our third speaker for this year. Just a quick introduction on what the Next Steps program is. As many of you might know, it's a post-secondary program for students who are generally between ages 18 and 21 at the Ideal School. It focuses on life skills, career skills, and overall independence and career readiness. So if anyone is interested in learning more, or if you know someone who might be a good fit for Next Steps, I can put my email in the chat and I would love to chat further. But for tonight, I'm really excited to welcome Cayle White, who will be speaking on OPWDD housing. Cayle is a certified benefits and work incentives practitioner. She is the benefits coordinator and head of future planning at the Silver Center for Special Needs at JCC Manhattan and also works as a private consultant. She focuses on helping families and individuals with disabilities navigate the channels of the State Office for People with Developmental Disabilities and other federal agencies to obtain much needed funding and services. She's also involved in outreach and educating the public about disability-related issues. So with that said, I will pass it over to Cayle, who I know has a lot to cover. Thank you, Cayle.
Thank you so much, Ryan, and thank you to all of you, and welcome to this webinar. And I want to thank the Ideal School for making this opportunity available to everybody. It's really amazing to take advantage of all of these resources and to empower yourself with as much information as possible. That being said, I hope you're not going to feel overwhelmed by the amount of information that I'm going to be sharing with you. By no means do I expect you to be taking copious notes, but just to understand some of the basic overarching concepts and basic rules and regulations as they apply to housing through the OPWDD. And also for those of you who have children or who are caregivers to children who are younger than 18, please keep in mind that housing really only begins to become available through OPWDD at the age of 18, but it's definitely something you should start thinking about, and especially if you're involved in transitions planning, which I always think that it's a good idea to think about this as, soon as possible, meaning like middle school or early high school. It's a good idea to start thinking about this now. And also, I'm not sure whether some of you have already enrolled your children in OPWDD or are even familiar with what OPWDD is. OPWDD is a very difficult acronym to pronounce. It stands for the Office for People with Developmental Disabilities. Each state typically has a similar office. In New York State, it's called the OPWDD. In New Jersey, it's called the DDD. Other states have their own names, and each one has different regulations. And also, unfortunately, right now, but we're working on it, it's not portable. Meaning, so if you have you do obtain eligibility for OPWDD in New York State, it doesn't automatically transfer. If you move to another state, you would have to reapply if you move to another state, but you do have Medicaid. One of the conditions of receiving OPWDD services is the funding comes through Medicaid, and Medicaid is a federal program. So the individual would have Medicaid, and Medicaid is, applies wherever the person lives. It does not replace their primary insurance. It becomes a secondary insurance if they wish to retain their private insurance or they are covered under their parents' insurance. But just keep in mind that if the individual does have Medicaid, it does not bump them off their existing insurance, but it is a necessary condition. It's required if the person wants to receive services and funding through OPWDD. So we're going to get started. I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction about what OPWDD is and also how the housing works. So also a few minutes before the end of this presentation, I'm going to take some questions. So please post them in the Q&A. I unfortunately can't answer very specific questions, but I can answer some general questions. Like if there's a term that I refer to that you're not sure of or you're not familiar with, I can explain what that is. If you're having specific difficulties and you are in the OPWDD system or you have related matters that you're concerned about. I don't typically take on individual cases, but I can help you troubleshoot some general issues. So I think Ryan will be giving out my contact information afterwards. And also, I do work primarily at the JCC Manhattan Center for Special Needs, where we have programs that are designed for people who meet the criteria for eligibility for the OPWDD, as well as the broader JCC that offers programming. So if you're curious about that, by all means, contact me about that as well. So without further ado, we're going to start talking about what OPWDD is. So
Yeah, I'm sorry, before we
yes, go
start,
ahead.
do you prefer to take questions as they go, or do you want to save them all for the end?
I think I'll save them all for the end because it's very
Yep.
possible. Sometimes people get, everyone here is thinking and they often get ahead of themselves. So it's possible throughout the course of the discussion that I will actually answer the question. So
Mhm.
sometimes if you wait until the end, it's a better idea. So OPWDD stands for the Office for People with Developmental Disabilities. And if an individual qualifies, meaning you submit to the application process, and if they deem the individual eligible, then you in perpetuity for the rest of their life will receive services and funding from the OPWDD. There is an asterisk. If the person is younger than 8 years old, if it's a child, they'll have to they get what's called provisional eligibility, and they have to recertify once they're 8 years old. But anyone who's 8 years old, if they are deemed eligible, retain that status for the rest of their life. And within OPWDD, there are two models of service delivery. In the past, there was only one. It was basically you received services from agencies and you didn't really have a lot of choice about what the types, and there wasn't a lot available in terms of the services that you could receive. But since 2014, they have started a program called self-direction, and it's very different it's actually more of a hybrid of the previous service model delivery and a new program. So just to give you an overview, what is OPWDD self-direction? So this is a service delivery model for individuals with developmental disabilities that gives them personal choice and flexibility over the goods, services, and goods that they require. So what that means is they give the person a yearly budget, and they can use that budget to spend on different categories. And then there are caps on the different categories. And they don't really hand you a pile of money. It's just kind of earmarked for you. And sometimes they pay the provider directly, and sometimes you pay and they reimburse you. And they have very specific categories of things that you can spend it on. And self-direction is administered through the State Office for Persons with Developmental Disabilities and the Medicaid Waiver Program. Prior to the introduction of self-direction, service delivery was limited to agencies with very limited resources and availability. So they have very specific categories for eligibility. And so these include autism spectrum disorder, with a little caveat I'll explain, an intellectual disability, meaning the person in their evaluations, in their IQ testing, they have a full scale IQ of 70 or lower. They can have cerebral palsy, a neurological impairment, epilepsy, familial dysautonomia, Prader-Willi syndrome, and however, they will hearing and vision impairments actually qualify for their own waiver, but they'll also consider them. And if somebody is applying as being on the autism spectrum, first of all, you have to have specific autism testing, meaning like an ADOS test or CARS or an ADIR diagnostic test. It's not acceptable simply for a doctor to write, okay, this person has autism spectrum disorder. They have to go through the specific autism testing. And then they also have to show through other scores that the person's functionality is impacted, meaning that their ability to perform tasks of daily living, independent living skills, socialization skills, that these are impacted by having ASD. And there are ways to do that. It's not really terribly complicated. So another condition is that the disability has to have occurred before the age of 22. However, this does not mean that if the individual is older than 22 that they can't apply. They just have to prove that the disability existed before they were 22. So how do you do that? So you collect all of their previous documentation, early intervention documents, earlier evaluations, IEPs, school reports, letters from experts documenting when they saw them. And this way you start to build a case to show that this person had a disability before age 22. But by all means, I have seen people in their 60s apply. It was a little complicated. We had to go back into their school records and so forth, but it is not impossible. But just because the person is older than 22 does not mean that they are no longer qualified. So once again, somebody on the autism spectrum with an IQ over 70 has to have low adaptive scores, showing how their adaptive function skills are impacted. And so that means that somebody who fits the Asperger's profile would also qualify. I often hear this, well, the person scored very highly on their IQ and they're high functioning. So really, what does that mean, high functioning? It means that on paper, academically, they might score very highly, but in terms of their daily living skills, there's a huge discrepancy there in their level of ability. So that's what you want to show, that this person has all of these academic skills, but they can't really implement them in their daily lives. They can't organize themselves. They have executive function issues. They can't, time management is an issue. They can't form relationships. They can't hold a job. This is the case that you're trying to build when you're applying for eligibility to OPWDD. And if I've seen people try to apply on the basis of learning disabilities and speech impediments, the OPWDD will reject these out of hand. They are very specific about the categories that they will accept, and you have to show the proper documentation. You submit an application through what's called a CCO. There are 3 of them in the state, or you can submit it by yourself. Before you do all of this, the OPWDD makes you attend something called a front door meeting, which is an online webinar, which kind of explains how the process works. And then they tell you how to apply. But they are very specific about the categories that they will accept. So don't try and force it through. It's not going to work. So in terms of OPWDD, once somebody qualifies for OPWDD eligibility and they turn 18, they are eligible for different housing options. So you don't have to make notes here. They do go through this with you, but just to get a general sense of what's available to the individual. So there are things called certified residential settings, and these are typically like group homes. They're agency managed. They provide services within the group home to meet their level of support, and they serve individuals with diverse disabilities. Some examples are supervised and supported IRAs, group homes. There are even supported apartments where agencies will facilitate an individual living in an apartment and come in and check in on them and deliver services in the apartment. There are institutional settings, depending on the person's, how severe their disability is. And these are prioritized on the basis of need. So if somebody urgently needs a housing configuration, they can go to a care manager who's managing their case and submit a form and try and prioritize them and get them in faster. Somebody who chooses self-direction cannot live in a certified residential setting. You can, but this is also not a huge obstacle, because you can actually, with self-direction, you can configure basically your own residential setting. Once you have eligibility, you can also choose to receive what's called the OPWDD housing subsidy. It used to be known as the ISS rental subsidy. So that allows you to create your own independent housing arrangement. And within one of these housing arrangements, you can have up to 4 adults living in one residence. So you could have your child and 2 roommates and a support worker, or your child alone with a support worker, or your child by themselves. As long as it's 4 adults or less, that is perfectly permissible according to OPWDD standards. So the issue with the residential settings is, wait, let me go back here, skip that. So the issue with the residential settings is there's really a restricted total lack of spaces. A lot of the group homes are completely filled. There are long waiting lists. So, there's haven't been any clear answers from the state about whether they're going to build more or fund more of these group homes. So if you go, there is a comprehensive listing from the OPWDD, and actually I can provide you with the link where they list all of the different agency-run homes and all of the different facilities that are available. You should go around, check out the websites, see what appeals to you, and actually go physically do an on-site visit. If some of these housing arrangements are appealing and you think could be a possibility, put yourselves on the wait list or even call the agency directly and say, is there any way you could get my child in there? But it's a very good idea to familiarize yourselves with the landscape, to understand the group homes that are available, because they service people with different disabilities. One of them might be for people who have mild intellectual disabilities but are more on the Asperger's end, and some might be for people who have more, intellectual disabilities or Downs or require more support. So it's a good idea to look through the listings of all of the different group settings and see what's available. So if you are, once again, if you're concerned that your family member, if you're worried about their independence, you're worried maybe that you're getting older and you won't be able to look after them for much longer, or you don't have somebody to delegate that responsibility to, it's a good idea, if you have OPWDD eligibility, talk to your care manager about it, and you submit a form called a CRO, which is called a Certified Residential Referral. And I have a link in here that so you can see an example of what that's like. And they get you into the system, get you on the wait list, start to get you thinking about and getting you in front of the providers who have all of the residential settings. And this is the resource guide. This is the link here. So you can, once again, you can contact the agencies directly, or you can do it through your care manager, but it's a very good idea to be familiar with the types of residential settings that are available out there. There's also, through your OPWDD self-direction budget, it will pay for somebody called a housing navigator. Housing navigators, their role is to help identify and locate housing options for families who use self-direction. Once again, it's only available to families who use self-direction. So they have very specific knowledge of what's available in different regions, and also of different housing configurations, what have been successful with some of their clients, different ideas for you, different landlords, different buildings, so that they can help you also to locate vacant apartments that might be suitable. And they also design and implement what are called housing action plans. So they help to troubleshoot and develop specific plans if there's going to be a shared living arrangement, how the people will live together, what their shared responsibilities will be, making clear what they can touch, what they can't touch, what to keep separate, who's going to pay what part of what utilities. So they develop very specific housing action plans. And once again, they are paid through self-direction budgets. And once they have a familiarity and personal knowledge of dozens of potential housing options, and they help to facilitate independent housing communities. So what a number of families have done when they feel frustrated that there are no residential settings available in their area is they basically create their own independent housing communities. Sometimes families will buy an apartment together. Sometimes they will rent an apartment together. Once again, if all of the roommates have this housing subsidy, they can combine their vouchers and they can get a pretty nice apartment with all of their combined funding. So, they're paid for in the specific budget line. In the self-direction line, budget is called ComHab or OTPS. Usually the broker will know how to fund this, but engaging a housing navigator if you are receiving self-direction is such a valuable tool, and it is so worth it because they really have that specific laser focused knowledge of what the housing resources are in your area or in a specific area of the state that you might be looking at. So your support broker will help you to locate a housing navigator, or you can find one yourself if you contact this organization called the New York Alliance for Inclusion and Innovation. They have a listing of what are called certified housing navigators, and it's through the New York Housing Resource Center, and they also publish profiles of the different housing navigators. So you can start to look for housing navigators that you think have the qualifications that you're looking for, or maybe, that you think you could work together with, your personalities mesh. So it's a good idea to look for and engage with a housing navigator. Obviously, you let your support broker, your broker is the one who handles your self-direction budget. Let them know that you want to engage, or you found a housing navigator and arranged for their payment through the self-direction budget. It's really, really worth it, because also you don't have to spend all that additional time learning about what's available. They know exactly what's available and what works and what doesn't work. So this is very wordy. There's a lot of information here, but basically the way that the OPWDD housing subsidy for self-direction works, it works very much like any housing choice voucher program like Section 8. So that does not mean that you are relegated to Section 8 buildings. It's a portable voucher, and it is acceptable by basically any landlord. It's the same as a monthly payment that you get from any government benefit agency. And it's a guaranteed benefit that they get once a month that can be paid directly to the landlord. And if landlords have never heard of it or they're skeptical about it, there's actually an entire information packet that can be given to them to educate them about it so they can understand. But by and large, it's becoming very popular, and landlords are accepting it, learning about it, and why not? I mean, it's a guaranteed source of monthly income that comes directly from a government agency, and it's not anything they should be nervous about. And so it's designed specifically to support income eligible people with developmental disabilities who want to live in the community. And this is really the whole foundational principle of the OPWDD. It's about living independently in the community, or with support in the community, and inclusion, and not being shut away in an institution, really living like everybody else would live independently in your own home in the community. The individual who is receiving the housing subsidy, once again, has to be at least 18, and they will be held financially and legally responsible. So that means that they have to be listed on the lease and or the mortgage. This can actually be used towards paying for and owning a property. And they will be listed on that lease as the responsible tenant who's responsible for conveying that housing voucher to the landlord. Of course, however, if you are most individuals can't really manage their own cases, so obviously their parents or some other caregiver will be overseeing that, but they are listed as the official leaseholder, as the official tenant on the lease. And they, of course, they are required to contribute approximately 30% of their countable income towards housing. And then the housing subsidy will make up the difference. And so it's the 30% net of their income, and that includes their unearned income, which are any other government benefits that they receive, but there are ways of actually taking deductions so that they reduce on paper what their countable income is, so they can pay less towards their actual rent. But generally, it comes out to be about 30% of their countable income has to be contributed to rent. And once again, the person can choose to live alone. They can live with roommates or live in caregiver. And there are additional subsidies that are available to cover things like their security deposits and moving expenses. So there are a whole range there's a whole range of funding that can be brought in to support this. And they have very specific also categories of the type of housing that's available. But I mean, generally, we don't go beyond these boundaries here. So you have either a single family home, a townhouse, a condominium, an apartment, a co-op, or any manufactured home that meets their basic criteria for housing assistance. It has to meet their housing quality standards, which any residence basically does. It has to be up to code, so that shouldn't be an issue. And very important to remember, the housing unit must be a specific separate unit with its own kitchen and bathroom facilities, also its own entrance and exit. It has to meet local and state standards as a legal separate dwelling unit, and it does not support renting a room. So there may be cases where someone can pay, contribute towards their family's mortgage or their rent, but they have to be specifically listed on that mortgage agreement or on that lease. They can't just pay, have an arrangement where they pay their family member every month for the use of that room. Either they have to have their own legally separate domicile, which I have seen families actually purchase an apartment and then rent it to their child, and then the child pays with the rental subsidy. Sometimes the OPWDD can be a bit, how shall I say, I don't know, uncomfortable with this. So sometimes the parents will, because they feel like it's not an arm's length transaction, so they might require the families to set up an LLC or a trust rather than having the children pay them directly. But I've seen this work on many occasions where they purchase an apartment and then the child will pay the parents rent using that subsidy for the apartment. So there were some recent updates that were very encouraging regarding the housing subsidy program. So there was an administrative directive that was issued in April 22 with new regulations and new guidance that provided clarifications on things like eligibility requirements and applications and kind of how to expedite the approval process and submitting applications, as well as around clarifying the roles of the recipient and care providers and care managers. And they also removed a limit of 25% of the units in a building having a resident receiving an OPWDD housing subsidy. So what they were trying to do was they were trying to prevent these buildings from essentially becoming certified, becoming group homes. So they had put a cap previously saying that only up to 25% of the residents of this building can be receiving the OPWDD housing subsidy, but really it doesn't matter. You can have 50% of the people. I don't think that ever happens, but 50% of the people in a building or 100%, it really doesn't matter. They also added, or there's a proposed, which I think was actually ratified, a cost of living increase of 5.4% that has been applied to all self-direction budget categories, in addition to the housing subsidy amount, so that it keeps up with the cost of living. And just to let you know, the account, the pool of funding that the person gets, their yearly budget is called a PRA, their personal resource account, and the housing subsidy is deducted from that. So it's not on top of their personal resource account. So let's say the person is allocated, I think the smallest budget I've seen for somebody who has like an Asperger's profile is about $30,000 a year to spend on the different OPWDD allowable categories. If they chose to use the housing subsidy, and let's say they were spending $1,200 per month, that would be deducted from that $30,000 PRA. So if someone already has OPWDD eligibility and they want to have their budget increased, their budgets are unfortunately not automatically increased. Their care manager or their broker submits a budget amendment and they will increase the amount of funding that the person has to reflect this cost of living adjustment. There's another stipulation that's required. If somebody is applying or wants to take advantage of the housing subsidy, they have to first apply for all of the other benefits that are available through New York City HRA, which includes Section 8 housing and EBT and TAMP and all of the other benefits that are of a HEAP, which is heating assistance. So you have to apply for all of these, and that's not terribly complicated. Section 8 basically is kind of redundant because the Section 8 wait list has been closed for 2 years and nobody expects it to be open anytime soon. So you literally write in your application, Section 8 housing lottery is closed, and that's that. And then they determine the time after you submit this application for the housing subsidy. They're trying to expedite it now to 90 days turnaround time that hopefully you'll hear from the OPWDD and get approval. And this is only really going to impact individuals receiving new subsidies. Anyone who was enrolled under the previous system, it's not going to affect them. They're going to be eligible for the higher rate, but they're not going to have to resubmit all of these documents again. So what's also really nice is in the past, the amount of money that the person received in their monthly subsidy was calculated based on this completely outdated rate that was so low. So what they did was they have now tied it to HUD fair market rent standards. And if you look this up on the HUD website, you can literally type in the zip code that you're looking for, and they will show you what the typical fair market rent standard is for that specific type of apartment, whether it's 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, 3 bedroom, or based on the number of residents who live there. Generally, well, we know they won't let more than 4 individuals live there, so anything larger than a 4 bedroom would generally not be accepted, but they have tied it to these fair market rent standards, which are much higher than the previous standards. Once again, the individual must contribute 30% of their income, but there are income offsets to lower their countable income on paper. So you can take deductions for things like healthcare costs, any healthcare premiums or deductions they had to pay, health insurance, paying for the health insurance fees, paying for an additional attendant, whether there's co-op or condo insurance they have to pay for. And also they divide the rent by the number of persons in the household to calculate what that person's exact percentage of rent is that they are responsible for. So the OPWDD, there are specific forms, the care manager and the broker will help you to fill out. We're hoping that these things will be approved after you submit them within 90 days, but obviously get your documentation and applications in as soon as possible if there's an apartment that you find that you're interested in. But actually you can start working on it before you find a place that you're interested in, so that everything is documented and approved and you're ready to go. So an additional stipend that's available in addition to the person's yearly budget, their PRA, is called an independent living stipend. So somebody who's moving from, say, living at home or living in a group setting or even in an institutional setting or a rehab, if they're moving for the first time to an independent living stipend, to an independent living situation, are eligible for this stipend, which can be several $1,000s. It's a one-time payout, and you are eligible for it within 90 days prior to or after moving to this new setting. There's something called an emergency stipend, which if for some reason the person loses their earnings and can't make up the rest of the rent that they owe, they can obtain this emergency stipend. There's also something called, once again, another form of transitioning from an institutionalized setting called the community transition stipend. Specifically, if you're moving from like a nursing home into an independent living situation, there's an additional stipend for this. So really maximize the use of all of these additional sources of funding from outside of your budget that are available to individuals who are moving to an independent living situation. And they cover things like deposits and moving costs. I think they might even, cover setup, with basic furniture and things like that. So it's really important to maximize the use of all of that funding, tapping into all of that additional funding. There's a new program that they're piloting with regard to college dorms. So this only applies to colleges within New York State. They have to be full-time accredited colleges. So OPWDD will not pay for the actual cost of tuition, but they will cover some of the actual residence fees involved. So you have to be, the student has to be living in a dorm style building that's owned by the same college, and they are not specifically designed for people with disabilities. Remember, it's about living in, the neurotypical, which can be challenging, community, but obviously if you require supports, there are allowances to help with support staff. The amount of monthly funding is calculated based on payment standards in that zip code. So you can check that out on the HUD calculator. Once again, it does not cover the cost of tuition. And if you want more information about this specific program, you can ask your support broker or your care manager, or just visit this link on OPWDD that gives more information about it and actually links to the specific documents that you have to submit. So this is a relatively new program. A lot of the things you're hearing about literally have just come out in the past couple of months. and care managers or brokers may not have heard of them. So once again, it's empowering yourself with as much information as possible and approaching them and saying, hey, have you heard about this program where if my child attends a full-time college, it can actually, OPWDD can pay for their dorm costs. And if they don't know, you can send them this link and educate them about it. There's also something that is available to everyone that is called the New York City Housing Connect Lottery. And what that means is you can, through a program called Housing Connect, and you can search that just, and actually I have the link here as well. You can apply for rental and home ownership opportunities. So they list on this portal all of these different buildings, and the majority are new that developers are building, and they are allocating a specific number of apartments or homes within this project to people with low income. And typically people who have developmental disabilities have fall below those income thresholds. So it's a win-win. It's an incentive for developers to build more new buildings and set aside more apartments for people with developmental disabilities. And obviously it's very good for the people with developmental disabilities because they get to live in brand new apartments in actually some real pretty nice areas. It's getting better. It used to be kind of on the outskirts, but now they're more in more desirable neighborhoods, but they are located all over the state. And so basically what you do is you go on the Housing Connect portal and you have to see whether the person meets the minimum thresholds for income, but you can find and apply for different rental and home ownership opportunities. To qualify, the household must meet the income and size requirements for a unit in the affordable development, and your household includes all of the people who will live in that unit. So in order to access these opportunities in Housing Connect, you scroll through, you put on filters, you look for specific apartments, and if there's ones that appeal to you, you apply to these specific lotteries for these apartments. And then if you win the lottery, you then upload all of your documentation to substantiate all of the financial information. And then they will grant the person, tenantship in these apartments. And what's nice about it is they're very long-term leases and the rents are substantially lower than market value. So you can really stretch how far that housing subsidy will go by getting, a nice new apartment for a relatively low, amount of money. So that's basically in a nutshell. I know that was a lot of information to absorb, but there are a lot of possibilities available, a lot of options to families who have children who qualify for OPWDD in terms of housing. I wouldn't panic about it too much if the child is 10, 11, 12 years old, but just to, if they're getting, more towards the young adult range where they're aging out of their Department of Education services, it's really good to start looking around, familiarizing yourselves with the types of options that are available and thinking about even configuring your own independent option. Within the OPWDD self-direction budget, you can pay a live-in caregiver. They can be there 24/7. They can just be there to check in with them a couple of times a week, but you design it however you want, and they are paid directly from that person's budget. You can also pay somebody called a paid neighbor who's like a backup for that paid caregiver. So you are facilitating that person's independence. Obviously, you don't expect to, unless they're really capable, you don't just throw them into an independent living situation and expect like everything's going to be okay. You need to provide some level of support. But thankfully, that is funded by the OPW, the self-direction budget, and you can make a really nice customized housing configuration for that individual. So with that, I will start looking at some of the questions. Okay.
You help to go in and read them for you, or you're good?
I could do it actually, unless you want to, I can read it. It's okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
So you must have Medicaid or the waiver. That is, you cannot get the waiver without Medicaid. I just thought you could apply for the waiver. You must have, the first step is to obtain Medicaid. You must have Medicaid in order then to obtain the waiver. And what the waiver means is basically they disregard the income of anybody else in that person's household. So they are just deeming that individual's household, income and assets so that they can qualify for Medicaid. Medicaid will not allow an individual, you're not supposed to have more than $2,000 in your bank account. They are not supposed to have more than about $16,000 of assets in their name. And they can only, if they're going to start earning income, it has to be below a certain income threshold. There are many workaround solutions for this. If this is a working adult, you can set up, or even a child, you can start setting it up while they're a child. You can set up a trust in their name so that they don't have any assets in their name. And there's nothing illegal or wrong about this. This is something the government actually encourages you to do, because that way they're building this nest egg that can be used to fund their living expenses, and it provides a safety net for them. So you can set up a special needs trust and put any assets in there, in there, and it's basically like they don't exist. And if they start working and earn above that Medicaid income threshold, there's something called the buy-in and various programs where you can still keep Medicaid but work at the same time, especially if you have a developmental disability. But the person must have Medicaid, and then someone will, or you can apply for the waiver on their behalf, and then they require both of those for OPWDD. So yes, so the 5.4% cost of living adjustment applies to the entire self-direction budget. And as far as the emergency transition stipend, the transition stipend only can be paid out once. And I think the emergency can be paid out more than once, but they look for, you have to really back it up with a lot of documentation, and they make sure that you have checked every source before they will give you this emergency, other source of government funding before they will give you this emergency stipend. Yes, they can also have what's called an ABLE account. An ABLE account is basically like a trust, and they can put a certain amount of funds. They can put up to $15,000 a year in an ABLE account, and it functions very much like a trust where their assets are basically invisible to the government, and there's a cap on an ABLE account. The maximum that can be in there is $100,000 a year, but sometimes it takes a while to get to that point. If there are any relatives who are going to be gifting them funds, you can put those funds, you can will those funds as part of an estate plan into an ABLE or special needs account. You can have both. You can have an ABLE. If you max out the ABLE account, you can set up a special needs trust. The special needs trust, there are no contribution limits. And basically it goes to pay for things, basic living expenses, but any additional extras that might go beyond that. You can even set up like a debit card attached to the special needs trust or ABLE account where you limit, you give the individual the debit card and, allow them a certain amount of money to spend every month. And that way you can control their spending. So there's various ways for the person to preserve their benefits if they start working, if they start accumulating assets, and also to keep, OPWDD, Medicaid, as well as things like SSI or SSDI. So there are various ways. So people should not be afraid that if they receive Medicaid, that they're not going to be able to work anymore or that they're going to lose it. There are various incentives actually available for people who want to work, and special needs trusts and ABLE accounts are really, really important. Thank you. Okay. So any programs for the more Asperger's profile for self-direction that I think are high quality. So within self-direction, there are various categories that you can spend the funding on. There are things like community classes. So community classes means basically any classes. It can't be from, a full-time, you can take classes at a college. You just can't take a full-time 4-year or 2-year load. The person can sit in and audit some of the classes. They can take certificate courses if there's a specific skill they want to learn. Let's say they want to learn computer animation or, video production or something of that nature. That's considered a community class. And there's a cap of $3,000 per year that can be spent on community classes. It can also be things, like, learning to play a musical instrument or taking a fitness class or, some sort of other skill-based class, learning, how to write or or arts or things of that nature. So as long as it's open to the public and it's an actual class, that those types of things are reimbursable through self-direction. And how do you find them? Well, basically any class that's open to the public, even if they want to take like a driving class, anything, they can use their self-direction for that. How do you find them? I mean, just, another category is something like gym memberships. Gym memberships are funded because in the person's life plan, which is like their IEP, it spells out what their specific goals are. And very often people will include things like working towards health and fitness and wellness goals. So if the person even wants to work one-on-one with a personal trainer, like I'll give a plug for the JCC. So we train our trainers to work with individuals who have developmental disabilities, but they also work with the main, neurotypical public. So those one-on-one personal training sessions would be reimbursable through their self-direction budget if they have in their life plan that their specific goals are fitness and nutrition and wellness and so forth. So there are a lot of different categories. This is something that your self-direction broker is supposed to educate you about of when you're creating your program basically and allocating your budget, deciding what you want to spend the money on. There are also recreational programs that are called respite programs. Some you can purchase some and attend through an agency, or you can go like at JCC, we have a lot of socialization programs that are considered respite. And it's a structured program where they're engaged in an activity. So that is also reimbursable through self-direction. So self-direction, there are so many different categories that you can use your budgets for and really, educate yourselves as much as possible, but also your brokers you need a self-direction broker. They should be knowledgeable about what the different categories are. So I don't know if anybody else, I have a few minutes here, if anybody else wants me to speak specifically if they've had issues with applications and eligibility. Very often families will apply. Right now, the OPWDD will prefers to accept applications through what are called CCOs. There are 3 CCOs for our region, New York City, and the CCO stands for Care Coordination Organization. These are the 3, they're huge organizations that funnel the funding from Medicaid and OPWDD to the individuals. And they now are the only ones who can submit pretty much the eligibility applications. Each one has an intake specialist, so you contact their intake specialist. The names of the CCOs are, I'll write them here in the chat so you can see. There is Care Design, Advanced Care, and Tri-County. And if you attend, which is a mandatory, the front door session for OPWDD, they will give you the contact information for the intake specialists. And the intake specialists are going to ask for recent neuropsych or psychoeducational evaluations, psychosocial evaluations, any previous documentation that they have, as well as an application and a recent physical form. And then they submit that information directly to the OPWDD for you. And then they will let you know if they receive a notification about whether the application has been approved or whether it has been kind of sent for a first step review or a second step review, which means that they are looking at the documentation again or bringing a new fresh set of eyes, another psychologist or expert in the department to review the application again, at which point you're always able to obtain new documentation that you think will support your case and then submit that along with it. And then if they're approved, hopefully, then the CCO will send you the notice of eligibility. It's called the notice of determination. And then the CCO will assign a care manager, and the care manager will start to coordinate the whole person's case and all of the, what the next follow up with the steps after that. Do I recommend any of these 3 in particular? Sorry, there are some, there's a lot of It really depends on the individuals within these organizations. I have found great care managers in some of them and then horrible care managers in some of them. And one thing that you should know, everyone has to work with a CCO if they have OPWDD. And if you are assigned a care manager and you really feel like they are not responsive, they're not professional, they don't know what they're doing, you can absolutely ask for another one. I have seen people go, and there's a lot of turnover. So I've seen people go through like 3, 4 in 1 year. If you are matched with a care manager who's really competent, be very nice to them because these are rare and try to hold on to them for as long as possible. But by all means, there's no reason why. I mean, they have very big caseloads and they have very poor training. So but still, if you don't hear back from them, if you're trying to find out an answer, or if there's a document that's missing and you don't know what's happening, and you don't hear back from them within, 3, 4 days, CC their supervisor. And if you don't hear back from the supervisor, they have a listing on their websites of who their regional managers are. Don't hesitate to put their regional managers email on there or to put an OPWDD officials email on there because then they will react much more quickly. So they are working for you. So if you feel like things are not moving ahead, I mean, you have to keep in mind, you have to be nice to them and understand they are given these massive caseloads, but by the same token, they should be proficient at what they're doing. So don't settle if it's like I've had people come to me and say, "Oh, it's 6 months and I didn't hear from my care manager." That's a major red flag. Do not wait a couple of days maximum. If you don't hear back from them, you don't have to be angry, but you have to be constantly on their radar because they otherwise will just completely forget about you in this avalanche of all of their other cases. So just make yourselves visible, not a pest, but just, visible and try to empower yourself. Don't rely on them to share the information because a lot of times the families know more than the care manager, sadly. So you just really have to be on top of things and insistent and but nice to the ones who are actually good. And they usually then become supervisors and then you have to kind of start again, but at least they know that you're somebody who's on top of things and they can't just brush aside. So very important to empower yourselves and be consumers and don't be passive. So, if anybody has any other questions about OPWDD or housing, I'm happy to answer. But, in terms of housing, it's very encouraging that we have these housing navigators available and that we have this increased subsidies available because you can really find some very nice housing arrangements.
Hi, can I ask a quick question? Can you hear
Sure.
me?
Sure, go ahead.
Sorry,
Yeah.
my chat feature wasn't working. So, but this is extremely helpful. First
Thank you.
off, really just very understandable in layman's terms. And I've been on a lot of these. My son is 20, almost 21. I've been on many of these different types of meetings, and this was by far one of the most.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
So thank you. And just on that last point that somebody asked, I actually did change my care manager. So I had somebody for 2 years and it was like pulling teeth. I just wasn't getting responsive. Things were taking so long. And then I moved to another one. So I highly recommend actually Care Design is fantastic now. But like Carly, you said, don't sit around if they're not being responsive. I mean, I understand they have a big caseload, but some of them were just incompetent.
Yeah, no, it's true. And you know what? I'm very pleased that you mentioned that. And so you can move from one CCO to the next if you feel like they're not responsive. And even within that CCO, you can go through multiple care managers. You don't have to, you can move around and it doesn't affect their budgets and it doesn't, there's not really a lot of paperwork involved in the transfers. So you can insist. And if they tell you, oh, it's not possible or you can't do it, it's absolutely possible.
So I have 2 quick questions. So just to clarify, we talked about the ABLE Act and you said 15,000 a year max, but 100,000 lifetime max?
That's correct. Yes. And so that's one of the downsides of the ABLE is that there's a contribution maximum. There's a cap on it, but by the same token, there are no management fees. Usually when you have a special needs trust, there's an attorney who's paid, a yearly commission to manage it. But the upside of that is there's no cap on the amount of money that you can contribute to a special needs trust. So you can designate, a life insurance policy that can be paid into a special needs trust. And there are a number of attorneys that specialize in this. I don't recommend going to just a standard attorney. You have to really have this specialized knowledge, because I've seen attorneys who are not familiar, who are not niche special needs attorneys, screw things up royally, where they put the wrong recipient on there and they put the wrong executor. And it just has taken years to wind through the courts and rectify all of the mistakes. So I really highly recommend going through a special needs financial planner or a special needs attorney, because they really know what they're doing.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And my other question is on the countable income that you mentioned. So the individual has to pay 30% of their countable income towards their rent before the housing subsidy sets in. Is that?
That's correct. That's correct. So there are various ways. So they count income and earnings, and they also count unearned income. So let's say the person receives SSI or SSDI per month. That's also considered their countable income, but you can take various deductions to lower that amount on paper. And they do ask for kind of, in-kind contributions, how much they get from their parents and so forth, but they don't ask for a lot of documentation to substantiate that. So if you're not able to calculate exactly on a monthly basis how much you're contributing to their living expenses, you don't have to panic. It's really things like, additional government benefits, any other, if they receive EBT or food stamps or TAMP or any other assistance, that's really what they want to see. And of course, any income, any earned income. And then they calculate the 30% based on that, and then they divide it by the number of residents in the apartment. And then they also calculate the subsidy based on the standard market rate in that area. And then that's how they arrive at the amount of the housing subsidy.
Okay, got it. Okay. Thank you. I think I understand that.
Okay,
a lot of information.
Yeah, no, I know, but if you check out the links and you go on the OPWDD website, they will explain it. But there's a formula there, and it's, that 30% threshold can be really minimized through taking various steps. And then if you go on the housing calculator, you can basically, now it's finally available, you can see what a typical, the maximum that they would be available for. And in some areas, it's very generous. I mean, you can imagine in certain parts of Manhattan here where a person can get, $2,000 a month. And if they pool those resources, if they have multiple roommates, you can get a pretty nice apartment, especially if you use the housing lottery, you stretch it even further.
Right. And I guess if you get a support worker who lives there, so that would be ComHab or paid neighbor, and then you would all split that as well, I guess.
Right. So then they would be considered a resident. So then that would further split the pool, the amount of rent among all the residents.
Oh, okay.
But there are various ways to kind of minimize the amount that the person contributes. But in a way, it's good because it shows that they have like skin in the game and they actually care about the apartment. One of the issues with some of the other housing vouchers is that people don't pay anything towards it. So they don't care if they destroy an apartment, right? Because they're not paying anything towards it. And sometimes the landlords are even more hesitant to take somebody with a Section 8 voucher as opposed to somebody who's getting OPWDD, also where they know there's a certain amount of supervision there, right? They know it's being managed by a family member. They know there's a case manager involved. So they feel actually a little bit more comfortable about doing that.
Right. Got it. Yeah, no, that was very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I'm just going to skip to this one last question. Just to clarify, if our neuropsychologist performed the appropriate testing and is telling us that yes, your child qualified, our next step is contacting OPWDD for a front door meeting. So anyone can attend a front door meeting at any time. The links are on the OPWDD website. You literally just type in front door meeting. It will come up with a link and you sign up and you watch the webinar and they will send you a confirmation that you attended that webinar. You have to hold on to that if you're applying to OPWDD. It's mandatory to show that you attended. And if the evaluation has to have been done within the past 2 to 3 years. If it hasn't, you have to do an updated one. And if it shows on there that they fit into any one of those eligibility categories, then you submit that to the OPWDD along with all their previous documentation, and then, through the CCO, and then they get back to you about whether they've been approved. But you can attend a front door meeting at any time. If you just want to see what it's like and, see what OPWDD is about, it's like basically not much more detail that I explained to you. Some people leave feeling more confused after they watch the OPWDD front door, so don't feel bad. They don't test you on it. They just basically deliver this slides presentation and send you a confirmation. And it's very important to hold on to that. But anybody can attend a front door meeting at any time. So, it's after 6 o'clock. I don't want to hold everybody. I know you have dinner and homework and things to do, but I just want to also just thank you all and thank Ryan for arranging this, and Ideal School, and to all of you intrepid caregivers for trying to get the source the best for your families. I applaud you, and just keep learning and, empowering yourself with as much knowledge as possible.
Cayle, thank you so much. That was really fantastic. And we're going to post the recording to our website. I know I'm going to sit back through it and rewatch and kind of try to get
It's not uncommon. It's a lot of information, and people watch the webinars multiple times. So people shouldn't feel like they're slow or they didn't catch the information. There's a lot to absorb, but you're not supposed to, you can internalize it, but you're not supposed to memorize it. You just get a basic sense of how things work. Age 18, eligible for housing subsidy, can live in a group. If you want to receive traditional services, you can live in a group home. Group homes are kind of few and far between their placements. But if you receive self-direction, you can use this monthly rental subsidy to live independently in your own apartment.
Great. Well, thank you so much.